Okay, I pushed day 3. I've got a new platform here. We'll see how well it works out. And I'll also update that note sheet so you have that as we go through the next lesson here. So we pick up right where we left off with these right before the Civil Rights Acts of 64. One thing on the note sheet from yesterday, the Freedom Summer of 1964 was a movement begun by a gentleman, Robert Bob Moses, Harvard-educated African-American from New York, who recruited younger people, idealistic volunteers, to travel down into Mississippi to both educate and increase registration. As we know, with the Mississippi Plan in 1890, disenfranchisement ran rampant throughout that state. So thousands joined, a lot of white college students, many of whom were Jewish, went down to the South under Mr. Moses' guidance to educate and register. Much resistance, sadly. Mississippi whites, specifically the KKK, pushed back. Some volunteers were assaulted, arrested, some even murdered. However, great success in that the focus was shifted. The civil rights movement, more awareness to that movement, and an increased number of registered African American voters in the South. So before we get to these violent images here, let's see. We ended with Dr. King's speech, and we'll begin now with the Civil Rights Acts that were listed on yesterday's note sheets of 64, which specifically ended segregation in all public facilities, and ended discrimination in employment, and established an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Then we had the 24th Amendment on there. 1964 abolished the poll tax, one way to disenfranchise all throughout the South, specifically, however, in federal elections. So you'll notice on the sheet there's a Supreme Court case, Harper versus Virginia Board of Ed. Virginia, along with 4 other states, kept poll taxes for other elections outside of federal elections. Virginia, Alabama, Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Deep South states continued their poll tax. In 1966, the issue went to the Supreme Court with Harper. In a 6-3 decision, the court ruled that any poll tax unconstitutional. So Harper v. Virginia Board of Ed really kind of strengthened the 24th. We jump over the 23rd then. That's District of Columbia gaining suffrage in 1961, suffrage for federal elections. And so we'll see electoral votes coming from the District of Columbia from this point forward. The last piece of legislation was the Voting Act of 1965, which ended literacy tests and other disenfranchised methods throughout the South. Large impact in the Deep South, where still in 65, many African Americans are not yet voting. By the end of 65, 250,000 more African Americans registered to vote in the South. That coupled with the Kennedy Voter Ed Project we mentioned in 1962, the Freedom Summer of 64, etc. So sounds like great success. Let's contextualize, however, we are 100 years out of the Civil War. A couple of significant reactions to the Voting Rights Act. One from the president, who will say we've just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come. And that ties back into your voting shift article, and really post 64, 65, that shift has taken place, and we'll see a red South from this point forward, more or less. Also, in response to the 65 Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, on 24th, we see violence erupt across the country. The best and worst example in Watts, Los Angeles, also on the note sheet, 34 dead, 4,000 in jail, 35 million in damage. Over 1,000 people were injured in that week of riots, which began in an African-American neighborhood in response to police brutality. 2 white policemen arrested an African-American man, suspecting him of drunk driving. And in the end, the National Guard's called in. You can see the results and the terrible images here. What happens in Watts. Sadly, it's one example of violence across the country, which had really begun to stem or underscore the one faction of the civil rights movement. Under frustration with Dr. King's passive resistance approach, we see the emergence of some violent groups, the Nation of Islam. It's listed as NOI on the note sheet. Black Muslims, Black Power, and one of the leaders here, Malcolm X. A brilliant guy, troubled background. He was born Malcolm Little in Lansing, Michigan in 1925. He'll later assume X, denoting his lost African surname. He'll rise up literally from prison to a leader in the African American movement and a leader in the Nation of Islam. Malcolm, we saw on that video, clearly a quick mind, a bright mind. His autobiography is recommended reading for anyone who's got extra time on their hands. But he was in prison, age 20 to 27. That's where he learns about the Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad, shown there on the left. He converts and starts to lead more of a violent resistance post 52 when he comes out of jail. Very charismatic, brilliant. I'm sure we wouldn't want to debate Malcolm X after watching that video with Mike Wallace. But he was controversial, directly breaking with Dr. King, calling him an Uncle Tom, a reference that he was subservient to the white leadership. He preached self-defense. He countered violence with violence. And that message really delivered in the Nation of Islam under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, which will prove historically, to be short on Islam, long on Elijah, the leader. But he preaches Black nationalism, he preaches separatism. Elijah's parents had been followers or supporters of Marcus Garvey of the 20s, you remember. The message from the Nation of Islam was self-improvement. And Malcolm will break with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam in 1964. And he breaks from separatism, tours Africa and the Middle East, starts to embrace the real teachings of Islam, more peaceful approach. His autobiography is published. This is Malcolm X in 1964. Just as he begins to turn more peaceful and preaching a biracial message, Malcolm was assassinated. With a click there, assassinated in as he's giving a speech in Manhattan. That split from Elijah caught up to him just as he was turning more powerful with his peaceful message. I've not watched it, but I noticed a Netflix documentary on the assassination. Still controversy surrounding that, who was involved and why. But the world clearly lost an exceptional leader, a brilliant mind in Malcolm X on February 21st, 65, as we added to that long list of assassinations we've been mentioning. So on the right is Stokely Carmichael, another example of a violent message and the break in the pursuit for equality in the civil rights community. Stokely was born in 1941, died in 1998 from Trinidad, went to Howard University, participated in CORE, the Freedom Rides. He becomes leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the group we mentioned starting those sit-ins in 1960-61. As leader of SNCC, however, Stokely became much more radical and ousted white participants from that group and became an outspoken advocate for African-American violence in response to violence from the whites, something that Dr. King was trying to extort and expose as nefarious and looking to as an example for the need for change. The message from new leadership is to meet that violence with violence, as the unveiling of that seemed to, in their eyes, it caused frustration. There was no concrete results. Stokely will be responsible for advocating Black Power. He coins that term, urging African American pride and socioeconomic independence, which is not a new concept. We know. He also coins the term institutional racism, which we can see evidence of throughout this era. So, and here we have the Black Panthers. This is a little bit later, 1966. Very radical, an urban group, caused many race riots, promoted individualism, African American culture, with phrases like "burn, baby, burn," "get whitey," a real violent reaction to the oppression that had lasted way too long. And we see by this time, 66, a clear split in the movement between the peaceful advocates and the violent advocates, which in the end, as we've spoken about before, derails any movement when we have a fraction in the approach. Same message, same goal in the end, different approaches, and we have movements fighting within each other, and civil rights is no exception to that. By 66, there were clear, definitive, violent wings of that movement, and the Black Panthers are evidence of that. More riots to discuss. Sadly, we went over Watts. We see here in Newark in 67, resulting in 25 dead. Detroit, 1968, 43 dead, and many more to follow. And we, in the end, will get another commission, before we talk about this sad slide, another commission by the federal government to look into the reasons for this violence, as if we needed that. But remember, the government's response, when in doubt, create a commission. So that Kerner Commission, 1968, it's on the note sheet, led by Governor Otto Kerner Jr. of Illinois, established by Johnson in 1967, July of 67. Specifically, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder, tasked with finding out or figuring out why the violence. And the final decisions and the final rulings did not help matters or reveal anything the country wasn't aware of, when it's concluded that racism and segregation were chiefly responsible for the violence, and that the U.S. was becoming two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And that commission, along with the riots and violence, proved that the struggle became much more than just segregation, predominantly in the South. Now the fight was for equality. It was long overdue, and equality all over, especially in the northern cities, especially post 64, 65. And we point then to the two great migrations of World Wars I and II. And in the end, this would become more economical, more of a fight for housing, education, social services, etc. And a fight against the media that viewed the world through a white lens that was just inflaming the tensions along the way. If we discuss this sad day, April 4th, 68, Dr. King was 39 years old. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 64. However, post-64, Dr. King struggled to find an avenue. Civil rights was legislated. It was the culminating achievement for his work, but with looking for a new target for activism, he shifted his fight to poverty and an end to Vietnam. The violent wing of African American civil rights was breaking away from Dr. King's organizations and foundation, and he shifted his focus, formally breaking from LBJ. And he was outspoken and clear about the money being wasted in Vietnam that was being taken away from the Great Society, pointing out poignantly over 300,000 spent to kill communists, under 100 per person to fight poverty at home. Again, that was over 300,000 per communist killed in Vietnam, under $53 per person to fight poverty at home. So April 4th, 68, 4 days after LBJ withdraws from the presidential race. You'll recall on March 31st, 68, Dr. King was in his hotel, emerging from his hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, room 306, the Lorraine Hotel. You see him there on the balcony. He was shot by a white supremacist sniper, James Earl Ray. Results of Dr. King's assassination: more violence, riots in 168 United States cities, 46 dead. Not the message that one of the most inspirational leaders in United States history would want in the wake of his sad passing. Certainly not the message of a leader promoting passive resistance. In the end, Dr. King gets credit for increasing voting in the South for African Americans. We see several hundred African American officials elected throughout the South. Northern cities electing African American mayors. Integration in schools went up, and a third of African American families rose to middle class over time, of course, but typically all of the above, are assigned to Dr. King's legacy. So with that civil rights discussion, we'll call it there. You have questions, please contact me directly through Remind. We'll push them out to everyone else and see if we can clear up any confusion. I know that went quickly. So we'll introduce here couple social and cultural movements, maybe getting through the hippies and looking at Nixon a little bit more. So the struggles of the 60s, racism, poverty, Vietnam, had serious cultural consequences across every portion of the United States, every demographic. The 60s are a watershed dividing two distinct eras in terms of values, morals, and behavior, where we have that conformity of the 50s and the rigidity of the 50s and a very loose, drug-induced 60s into the 1970s. And this begins with a negative attitude towards all kinds of authority. That credibility gap had extended beyond just government and had been assigned then to just authority in general by these young baby boomers coming of age by the time we get to the 60s. And best example of that would be the New Left, Students for a Democratic Society, formerly established in 1962 by Tom Hayden, all of which is on our note sheet. Tom Hayden, who issued a Port Huron statement, at the University of Michigan in '62, calling for university decisions to be more democratic with student input as well as leadership from the university, with the main goal for SDS to remake America into a more democratic society. Again, we see evidence of that credibility gap and questioning authority from college-aged students. The supporters of SDS become known as the New Left. New Left to distinguish themselves from the old left, a grassroots movement of the 1930s with more of a leftist Marxist bend, not present here, just a little more to the center, still clearly on the left, but a left-wing movement to push back against authority. And we see here an image of Professor John Searle at UC Berkeley, as the caption indicates there. Part of this free speech movement in '64 really stems from SDS. This is the first major student protest where John Searle, as professor, supported free speech and speaks out for students, calling for an end to university restrictions on student political activities and campus rules involving drinking, dorm visits, things like that. So again, students calling for more of a democratic say in university policies. This had actually begun before Searle by Jack Weinberg in October of '64, who set up a table to promote CORE. And when the police asked for his name, he refused. He gets arrested, and the students sat down in protest to Weinberg's arrest in October, as he would not give up his name distributing CORE literature. And it was that arrest really that spawned the free speech movement, as you can see here, the next month in November of 64. This will turn violent also. Hundreds of campuses were disrupted or closed because of war protests, and now we get this free speech movement and call for democracy and this pushback against all authority. In the end, it'll get violent with the Weathermen, not Hendrix. We'll get to him in a second. But the Weathermen took the name from a Dylan lyric. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. Part of the New Left, a radical wing, which of course is going to indicate violence, who began blowing up the campuses that they paid to attend. Arson, bombs, destroying campuses. And that turn to violence did what it typically does to movements. Lost momentum, and it revealed not an organized student body calling for democratic values. It revealed an out of control student body being radical and causing damage. So the movement kind of dies out after the Weathermen start to destroy that which they paid to attend. So then we'll turn to this counterculture. Here are the hippies, the extension of the beatniks of the 50s, to be hip, to be cool, a new left that develops into this counterculture expressed by young people with rebellious closing movies, flower children, communal living, a lot of folk music. I'll try and get you some links to so you can listen to people like Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Hendrix shown here, the Beatles, the Stones, Morrison, Janis Joplin, people like that, who we'll see images of in here. But let's synthesize or connect across time. What we see here, to a larger extent, to a larger degree, will parallel what we said about the flappers of the 1920s. It's a small percentage of society. What might make the hippies a little bit different than the flappers is that this kind of extended beyond a small little group of rebellious women that we saw in the 20s to really define an entire generation. And we have many more. Of course, not everyone was a hippie, but many more young people adopting the lifestyle and really in protest to authority, Vietnam, and the craziness of the 1960s. So here we just have some images of Marvin Gaye's video that was up yesterday. Hopefully we enjoyed not only the music and the brilliant voice that you heard there, but the message that was going on, and just questioning the violence in society and the decisions made by government, and where we're going from here, with some people succeeding and others dying. So Joan Baez on the left, there's Dylan on the right, Beatles, a young Rolling Stones, and old Rolling Stones. They were able to show some continuity across time, still attracting fans today, still performing today, despite a long, arduous career on their bodies. Morrison symbolized that poetic voice of the 60s, if you're familiar with any of the music of the Doors, and Janis Joplin, the same there. You can see both kind of symbolize and epitomize that counterculture look. Woodstock here. We'll try and also get some videos for you to watch regarding Woodstock, which was the summer of 1969. Took place on a 600-acre farm in upstate New York. Roughly 400,000 people attended. Some numbers will go beyond that, but it was a 3-day celebration of music and peace, as the flyer says there, just to kind of push back against the tumultuous days of the 1960s. And it worked. All those people amassed in one place for 3 days with virtually no violence. Massive drug use, casual sex, and disregard for social order, but it went off peacefully, and the message resonated throughout society, not just as a massive party, which in retrospect we could say it was, but as a symbol of what could be accomplished with all those people together, and kind of a last hurrah, peaceful hurrah of the counterculture. Sadly, the organizers tried to replicate this in December on the West Coast. This Woodstock Nation in San Francisco turned violent. as most movements do, sadly, here. It's Altamont, California, if you want to look that up. The Stones hired the Hells Angels for security during their performance of a famous song, Under My Thumb. A 19-year-old African-American took out a gun in the front row, and the Hells Angels beat him to death. 3 others were killed that night out in Altamont, California. So after that, December of '69, the interpretation of the counterculture had shifted. Many see it as an idealist quest that turned radical, like the civil rights. The counterculture simply had become counterproductive, and many were discredited by older Americans, that middle America, that silent majority that Nixon was talking about. One last component of that counterculture would be a sexual revolution. Part of the counterculture lasts into the '70s. The FDA approved the birth control pill in 1957, and in 1960 that gets approved for contraception. 2.3 million people using that by 1963. So we see here John Lennon waving goodbye to the '60s, a 1970 picture there. We'll pick up tomorrow with our good pal here, Betty Friedan, and the women.